Between 1860 and 1880, the Academy of Saint Aurélien operated quietly in the outskirts of New Orleans. It was presented to the public as a place of discipline and musical refinement for young novices preparing for a lifetime of choral service. Yet over the span of 11 years, records show that 79 registered pupils ceased to appear in any official registry, their departures never explained to families or authorities. What remains in the archives today is an incomplete trail of administrative paperwork, altered enrollment logs, and an unusual absence of investigative reports. To the citizens of New Orleans, the Academy of Saint Aurélien was a symbol of cultural and moral instruction. Known for its rigorous choral program and strict boarding system, the institution cultivated an image of serenity and order. Its public concerts were attended by merchants, officials, and travelers who praised the precision of its performances. No public notice was ever given regarding missing pupils, and when questioned, administrators provided identical statements citing transfers to other institutions. Local newspapers printed only glowing reviews of the choir's achievements, never mentioning the attrition. The Academy's reputation was built on discipline, ceremony, and the quiet assurance that its operations reflected the city's highest standards. The Academy of Saint Aurélien occupied a walled tract of land along a marsh-fringed road that curved away from the busier streets of New Orleans. Its main building was a symmetrical three-story structure faced with pale plaster and trimmed in dark shutters. A detached chapel stood to its right, connected by a covered walkway that sheltered the novices as they moved between lessons and daily services. Across the courtyard were two long dormitory halls that faced one another, separated by a gravel path lined with camellia bushes. Beyond the formal gardens, a fenced orchard provided fruit for the dining hall. The arrangement of the grounds gave the impression of order and permanence, a deliberate separation from the distractions of the city. Prospective families first encountered the institution through an application process that was meticulously formal. Letters were sent in inked script, outlining the Academy's standards, tuition requirements, and the virtues expected of those admitted. Guardians were assured that the novices would receive not only instruction in music, but also education in mathematics, penmanship, geography, and the study of classical languages. The most valued feature, however, was the choir itself. The Academy promised rigorous voice training, and each novice was expected to contribute to the ensemble's celebrated repertoire of sacred and seasonal works. Visitors to the Academy during its early years often remarked on the precision of its operations. The grounds were swept daily, uniforms were immaculate, and the choral rehearsals could be heard at fixed hours from the chapel, each note measured and synchronized. Even the schedule of bells that governed the day was precise, ringing at intervals that never varied. The effect was one of controlled harmony, both in sound and in routine. The Academy appeared to run as an unbroken sequence of preparation, practice, and presentation. The institution's public reputation was carefully maintained through regular performances in the city. These concerts were attended by a cross-section of New Orleans society, from local officials to visiting merchants and traveling dignitaries. The novices, dressed in identical robes, performed without visible signs of fatigue or hesitation. Programs for these events were printed on heavy paper and distributed weeks in advance, listing the works to be sung and noting the Academy's distinguished patrons. Press coverage was uniformly favorable. Reviews praised the clarity of the voices, the refinement of the arrangements, and the apparent discipline of the pupils. Not once in the printed accounts did a journalist remark on any absence or turnover among the performers. The internal governance of the Academy was handled by a small board, chaired by the institution's founder, Madame Céline Marot. Born into a family of French merchants, she had studied voice in Paris before returning to Louisiana to establish her school. Her authority within the walls of Saint Aurélien was absolute. She was assisted by a vice-director, who oversaw the academic curriculum, and a musical director who managed the choir's rehearsals and repertoire. Beneath them were a handful of resident tutors who lived on site and supervised both classroom instruction and dormitory life. The application records that survive in archival holdings suggest a steady flow of new entrants in the period between 1860 and 1870. Enrollments peaked in the late 1860s, a time when the city's population was recovering from economic disruptions and renewed investment in cultural institutions was encouraged. The academy's fees, while substantial, were considered a mark of prestige for those able to afford them. Wealthy families often sought places for their younger children who might not be in line to inherit businesses or estates, but could still benefit from an education in the arts. It was not unusual for the academy to refuse an applicant if the child was deemed unsuitable for the choral program. Records from these instances are terse, listing reasons such as inadequate voice quality or failure to meet academic expectations. Those accepted were issued a list of personal items to bring, along with measurements for uniforms, and a schedule for term beginnings. Once admitted, the novices were expected to remain within the grounds for the duration of the term, save for approved visits or holidays when the gates were opened to families. Daily life at Saint-Aurélien was organized with a degree of precision that impressed visitors and intimidated new arrivals. The morning bells sounded before dawn, followed by a sequence of tasks and rehearsals. Each novice was assigned a seating position in the chapel that never changed during the term. Music was taught in a tiered system, with the more advanced pupils coaching the newer arrivals under supervision. Academic lessons took place in small rooms with long wooden desks, where handwriting was monitored and corrected in detail. Meals were plain but orderly, served in a dining hall where conversation was minimal and supervised by tutors. The city regarded the academy as a source of civic pride, particularly because of the refinement of its performances and the dignity of its public image. Concerts held in the city's larger venues often attracted audiences who could not otherwise afford to attend formal musical events. The presence of the novices in public processions or seasonal ceremonies was a familiar sight, and it reinforced the idea that Saint-Aurélien was both a cultural and moral asset to New Orleans. This perception was actively encouraged by the board, which maintained correspondence with local authorities and ensured that any matters involving the academy were addressed privately rather than in open forums. Inquiries from families about day-to-day affairs were typically answered with brevity. The academy's correspondence files show a preference for short, formal replies that reiterated policies rather than providing detailed accounts of individual pupils. Matters of attendance, performance schedules, or minor infractions were addressed within the academy and rarely shared beyond its gates. In this way, the institution managed to preserve a singular narrative of excellence, insulated from outside scrutiny. The academy's emphasis on ceremonial presentation extended even to its groundskeeping and architecture. Visitors described the front gardens as being pruned into exact geometric shapes, with the gravel paths raked into symmetrical lines. The main hall displayed portraits of past benefactors, framed in heavy wood and polished regularly. The chapel's interior was notable for its clean arrangement of benches, its well-maintained organ, and the absence of ornamentation beyond what was required for performance. These surroundings contributed to the impression that Saint-Aurélien was dedicated entirely to discipline, music, and the orderly formation of its pupils. What was less visible to the public was the strict separation between the novices' living quarters and the rest of the complex. Dormitories were closed to visitors, and even during public open days, access was limited to the gardens, the chapel, and the main administrative hall. This separation was justified as necessary for maintaining focus and avoiding distraction. The boarding structure meant that most pupils spent extended periods without direct contact with their families, save for letters exchanged under the supervision of tutors. Outgoing correspondence was collected and dispatched through the academy's own postal arrangements, further reinforcing the institution's self-contained nature. For the city's elite, placing a child in Saint-Aurélien was both a commitment and an investment. It signaled participation in a cultural legacy and affiliation with an institution known for its formality and refinement. Families often spoke of the academy in terms of honor and advancement, confident that its leadership acted with the utmost propriety. Yet even in these favorable accounts, there was an undertone of distance, as though the internal workings of the place were beyond the concern or comprehension of outsiders. What mattered was the polished surface, the uniformity of the choir, and the absence of public controversy. The first indications that Saint-Aurelien's stability was less secure than it appeared did not come from public complaint, but from subtle irregularities in its own printed materials. Programs for concerts occasionally listed names of performers who, by the time of the event, were absent from the ensemble without explanation. Yearly rosters showed inconsistencies in enrollment numbers, though these discrepancies were minor enough to escape general notice. In official statements, such changes were attributed to transfers, illness, or family decisions. None of these explanations were questioned in the press, and within the Academy's correspondence files, the subject was treated with the same formulaic brevity that characterized its other communications. The Academy's ability to manage its public profile relied heavily on its control of information. Internal reports were written in a style that favored concise statements over detailed explanations, and these records were kept in a locked cabinet in the administrative office. Access to them was restricted to Madame Marot, the vice-director, and a clerk employed specifically for maintaining the archives. Visitors, even those with official standing, were not permitted to view the ledgers without a formal written request, and such requests were rarely approved. This system allowed the Academy to curate its own history in a manner that matched its outward appearance. Beyond its musical reputation, the Academy cultivated influence in civic circles. Madame Marot regularly hosted select gatherings in the administrative hall, inviting municipal figures to hear preview performances or view rehearsals in progress. These events were conducted with precision, timed so that the guests would observe only the most polished aspects of the institution. Conversations focused on music, the arts, and the cultural enrichment of the city. Any mention of administrative matters was carefully avoided, replaced instead with discussions of upcoming concerts or the introduction of new musical works to the repertoire. The city's newspapers played an important role in reinforcing the Academy's image. The editors of several publications had personal ties to members of the Academy's board, and reviews of concerts often read like official notices rather than independent critiques. Descriptions emphasized harmony, elegance, and discipline, portraying Saint-Aurélien as a near-perfect example of artistic and moral education. When articles mentioned individual pupils, it was to commend their voices or academic accomplishments. No suggestion of irregularity appeared in print. For parents living outside New Orleans, the Academy's printed brochures were the primary source of information. These were sent by post in heavy envelopes, containing photographs of the chapel and gardens, lists of faculty members, and testimonials from satisfied families. Each edition highlighted recent performances, awards, or cultural events attended by the choir. Tuition schedules and term dates were included, but no reference was made to internal policies beyond the brief statement that all pupils were subject to the Academy's rules and supervision. At all times, the materials projected confidence and order, presenting Saint-Aurélien as both a safe environment and a distinguished educational choice. Those who worked within the Academy were expected to uphold this image without deviation. The resident tutors followed strict guidelines in their interactions with visitors, students, and outside contacts. All conversations regarding pupils were to be referred to the administration, and staff were reminded regularly that any public comment about the Academy's affairs must first be approved. This policy extended to correspondence. Letters sent by staff to their own families were subject to the same collection process as those written by pupils. The stated reason for this measure was to protect the privacy of the institution and its members. During this period, the Academy's choir reached the height of its local acclaim. Seasonal performances in the city drew audiences in numbers that exceeded the capacity of the venues, leading to the introduction of ticket reservations. The choir also began performing in select private residences for patrons who contributed to the Academy's endowment. These smaller events were viewed as a mark of distinction, and those invited often spoke of them as cultural highlights. The level of refinement displayed at such gatherings reinforced the perception that Saint-Aurélien was not merely an educational institution, but a custodian of the city's artistic reputation. The careful orchestration of public appearances extended to the novices themselves. They were instructed in proper posture, controlled gestures, and the etiquette of formal presentation. Uniforms were inspected before each outing, and rehearsals for concerts sometimes included practice in entering and leaving the stage in precise formation. The effect was to create an impression of unbroken unity, with no visible difference between individual members. This uniformity was central to the Academy's image, as it conveyed the idea that the institution operated without internal disruption. Within the grounds, the novices' routines remained highly structured. Each day was segmented into short intervals devoted to study, rehearsal, and practice. The clock in the main hall, maintained with meticulous care, governed the flow of activities. Deviations from the schedule were rare and typically reserved for special events or visiting dignitaries. Meals were served at the same hour each day, with seating arrangements assigned in a manner that reinforced discipline. Silence was maintained during certain periods, such as the walk from the dormitories to the chapel or the first portion of evening study time. The architecture of the buildings reinforced the Academy's principles. The dormitories were arranged in long, narrow rooms with identical beds and small wooden trunks at their foot. Windows were high and narrow, admitting light while limiting outside distractions. The classrooms were similarly plain, containing only the necessary desks, benches, and teaching materials. In the chapel, the organ's polished wood gleamed under the light from tall windows, and the arrangement of the choir stalls allowed for both symmetry and efficiency. Even the arrangement of the gardens seemed calculated to project an atmosphere of order. The public saw only the cultivated surface of Saint-Aurélien. Few visitors had reason to question its practices, and those who did rarely pursued their inquiries beyond an initial request. The Academy's administration responded to such matters with the same concise language found in its official correspondence, a tone that discouraged further questioning. In an era when institutions of culture were seen as symbols of civic pride, there was little appetite for scrutiny that might disrupt the accepted narrative. Saint-Aurélien's reputation was further strengthened by its participation in regional gatherings of musical societies. Delegations from the Academy traveled to nearby cities to perform alongside other choirs, often returning with favorable mentions in the host city's press. These excursions were documented in the Academy's own publications, which highlighted the recognition received from peers in the musical field. The effect was to present the institution not only as a leader in New Orleans, but as a respected contributor to the broader cultural landscape. The Academy also benefited from the discreet generosity of certain benefactors who preferred to remain unnamed. Donations in the form of instruments, sheet music, or repairs to the buildings were acknowledged only in general terms, without identifying the donors. This approach allowed Saint-Aurélien to maintain the image of self-sufficiency while quietly relying on external support. The relationship between these patrons and the board was one of mutual advantage. The benefactors gained private access to the Academy's most exclusive performances, while the Academy secured resources that reinforced its public image. The overall impression conveyed to the citizens of New Orleans was one of stability, refinement, and cultural leadership. Few questioned the workings of an institution that appeared so well-ordered and so devoted to the arts. The very absence of public controversy seemed to affirm its integrity. In this way, Saint-Aurélien's carefully maintained façade became a part of the city's identity, accepted as a fixture of its social and cultural life, without the need for closer examination. The first signs that the Academy's internal operations might not match its outward presentation appeared in the form of small inconsistencies noted by a handful of observant visitors and former staff. These were not dramatic revelations, but subtle details that stood out to those accustomed to precise order. A missing name in a concert program, a sudden reassignment of a vocal part, or the unexplained absence of a familiar face at a seasonal performance. On their own, these incidents seemed minor, but they appeared with a frequency that was difficult to dismiss entirely. One early indication came from a ledger in the possession of a former music instructor who had departed the Academy for a position in another city. Among his personal papers was a copy of the choir's rehearsal schedule from a previous year. Certain names listed for solos or featured sections in rehearsals did not appear in the corresponding programs for public concerts. The instructor had made no commentary on the matter in his notes, but the pattern was consistent across several months. In the city itself, a few parents began to notice changes in the Academy's term rosters. when they compared printed lists from one year to the next. The Academy explained these differences in familiar terms: transfers to other schools, family relocations, or withdrawals for personal reasons. These answers were brief and accompanied by assurances that the pupil in question had departed in good standing. The tone of these communications discouraged any further inquiry, and most families accepted the responses without pressing the matter. One of the most unusual features of the Academy's administration was its reluctance to share detailed academic records with parents. While guardians received general progress reports at the end of each term, these documents were standardized summaries that provided little information beyond a pupil's standing. In music, academics, and conduct, specific grades, test results, or teacher evaluations were rarely included. When asked for additional detail, the administration often replied that the summaries were sufficient for understanding a pupil's progress. This approach kept correspondence brief and limited the amount of personal information leaving the Academy. A similar reserve was evident in the handling of the Academy's internal census. At the beginning of each term, a list of enrolled pupils was compiled for administrative purposes, separate from the public rosters. These internal lists were stored in the main office and were not distributed outside the staff. In several surviving copies of these internal records, notations appear beside certain names in handwriting that does not match the main entries. The notations are brief, consisting of single words or initials whose meaning is not explained in the surviving documents. Some of the tutors who served at the Academy for only a short time later recalled the suddenness with which certain pupils ceased to be part of their classes. These departures were often announced to staff in short meetings where the explanation was no more detailed than the standard statements given to families. A new seating chart would be issued, and the vacant place would be reassigned without further discussion. Those who inquired beyond this were reminded that personnel and enrollment matters were handled exclusively by the administration. Visitors who attended rehearsals inside the chapel occasionally remarked on changes in the ensemble's composition from one visit to another. In some cases, these changes occurred within the same season, without the public acknowledgement that typically accompanied the promotion or graduation of a pupil. Since the Academy trained multiple choirs for different purposes, the shifts in membership could be explained as reassignments between groups. Nonetheless, these alterations were notable because they often affected pupils who had previously held prominent positions in performances. An unusual aspect of the Academy's record-keeping was the separation of musical archives from general administrative files. The scores, programs, and rehearsal notes were kept in a locked cabinet near the chapel, under the care of the musical director. Access was limited to certain staff, and the records were not cross-referenced with academic or residential files. This compartmentalization meant that a complete record of any one pupil's time at the Academy could only be reconstructed by consulting multiple, separately controlled collections of documents. The resulting fragmentation made it difficult for outsiders to verify the full history of an individual's enrollment. Some of the earliest concerns came from within the city's small network of music patrons, who were accustomed to tracking promising young voices from their first appearances. On occasion, a patron would inquire about a pupil whose performance had attracted interest, only to be told that the pupil was no longer enrolled and that no further information could be provided. While this caused mild disappointment, the matter rarely extended beyond a passing comment. The Academy's prestige and its role as a cultural institution often outweighed any curiosity about its internal decisions. A few merchants who supplied goods to the Academy noticed irregularities in the quantities requested from one term to another. Orders for uniforms, for example, would occasionally decrease mid-term in a way that did not match the expected needs for a stable enrollment. The explanations given for such changes were framed in practical terms, such as adjustments for stock on hand or delayed delivery schedules. Invoices were paid promptly, and the suppliers had little reason to investigate further. Despite these small indicators, the Academy's public reputation remained secure. Its seasonal concerts continued to draw large audiences, and the city's press continued to publish unqualified praise. The occasional disappearance of a name from a program or a roster was viewed as an ordinary occurrence in a boarding institution where changes in enrollment were inevitable. Only in hindsight did some observers connect these minor irregularities into a broader pattern. It is worth noting that the Academy's isolation from the city's daily affairs may have contributed to the lack of early scrutiny. Situated beyond the busiest districts and surrounded by its own grounds, Saint-Aurélien operated in a largely self-contained manner. This physical separation allowed it to maintain a controlled environment, where changes in its operations could occur without immediate observation from the public. Even families with pupils enrolled at the Academy typically saw the grounds only during designated visiting days, when every detail was prepared in advance for presentation. The structure of the Academy's governance also played a role in limiting external oversight. The board met privately, and minutes from these meetings were not made available outside the institution. Membership on the board was by invitation, and those invited were often individuals with strong ties to the Academy's leadership. This ensured that policy decisions reflected the priorities of the existing administration. The city authorities, viewing the Academy as a cultural asset, did not intervene in its internal affairs unless directly invited to attend ceremonial events. By the end of the 1860s, the combination of controlled information, private governance, and an unbroken record of public acclaim had created an environment in which minor discrepancies attracted little notice. In the absence of open complaints or public incidents, there was no apparent reason for closer examination. The signs that did exist were dispersed among various individuals and records, each holding only a small piece of a larger picture. At the time, no single person outside the Academy's administration possessed all of the information needed to recognize the pattern in full. One of the less discussed aspects of the Academy's operations was its habit of modifying official records before they left the premises. This was particularly noticeable in the annual summaries sent to select cultural societies in the region. These reports included attendance figures, lists of performances, and the number of pupils enrolled. On comparing multiple years, subtle changes could be seen in the way figures were presented. A decrease in the number of pupils from one year to the next was sometimes expressed as a realignment of enrollment or a curricular restructuring without further detail. Such wording conveyed an air of deliberate planning rather than unexpected change. The same practice was observed in correspondence with donors. Letters to benefactors highlighted achievements, awards, and notable performances, while enrollment statistics were condensed into rounded figures that gave no indication of specific changes. These letters were often accompanied by photographs taken on days when the full ensemble was present, ensuring the images displayed no visible gaps. In this way, the presentation of the choir to its most important supporters remained consistent, regardless of any shifts in actual membership. Internally, staff observed that certain administrative tasks were carried out by a very small group. Record updates, for instance, were not delegated to general clerks but handled by the vice director or an assistant personally selected by Madame Marot. The process was not rushed, but it was not explained either. Tutors were informed of changes to their class lists after the fact, with the expectation that they would simply adjust to the new arrangement. Those who asked for additional context were reminded that the Academy valued discretion above all else. During visiting days, families occasionally noticed that the seating arrangements in the chapel differed from the previous term. This was not unusual in itself, as vocal development could lead to changes in part assignments, yet it was sometimes remarked upon that entire rows in the choir stalls were now filled by novices who had not been present during earlier visits. The Academy offered practical explanations for these shifts, pointing to the arrival of new students mid-year or the graduation of older ones. While such reasons were plausible, the number of replacements in some years was higher than expected for an institution known for multi-year programs. Merchants delivering goods to the Academy also noted an unusual practice. Deliveries were received at a side entrance, and invoices were signed by the same small group of administrative staff, regardless of the nature of the delivery. Uniform makers, in particular, sometimes found that their orders were altered after initial agreement, with quantities reduced or delivery dates moved forward without clear reason. Payment was always prompt, and the Academy's reputation as a reliable customer prevented such changes from raising more than mild curiosity. In cultural circles, Saint-Aurelien's influence continued to grow, and its association with civic events ensured it remained an institution of high standing. Seasonal concerts, charity performances, and private recitals for notable figures reinforced the perception of excellence. Guests at these events saw only the polished surface, perfect harmony, disciplined presentation, and an unchanging commitment to artistic refinement. The quiet adjustments behind the scenes were invisible to the public and shielded from scrutiny by the Academy's carefully managed image. A small number of letters in the city archives offer a glimpse into private concerns expressed by some correspondents. These letters, sent from distant relatives or acquaintances of pupils, inquire politely about changes in correspondence frequency or unexpected terminations of enrollment. The replies from the Academy were uniform in tone, acknowledging the concern while offering short, generalized explanations. No additional documentation was provided, and the matter was closed with a formal signature. The insularity of the Academy's operations also extended to its relationships with other institutions. While St. Aurélien maintained cordial contact with certain schools and conservatories, these interactions were selective and formal. Exchange programs were non-existent, and joint performances were rare, usually limited to large civic celebrations. This lack of external integration meant there were few opportunities for outsiders to observe the Academy's day-to-day functioning. In turn, this reinforced its ability to control the narrative of its own activities. Even those who might have had the means to examine the Academy's affairs more closely often lacked the motivation to do so. The combination of cultural prestige, personal connections, and apparent stability discouraged critical inquiry. Any small inconsistencies noticed by parents, merchants, or visiting patrons were viewed in isolation, not as part of a larger pattern. Without an obvious disruption to the Academy's public schedule or visible decline in performance quality, there seemed no reason to connect the details into a broader conclusion. Financial records from this period suggest that the Academy was not in difficulty. Tuition payments were steady, and donations continued to arrive at a consistent pace. Repairs to the buildings, updates to the chapel's organ, and the maintenance of the grounds were all carried out without delay. The absence of financial strain further reduced the likelihood of external questioning, as institutions in good fiscal health were generally assumed to be operating without significant problems. The local press remained an ally in this regard. Articles continued to present Saint-Aurélien as a model of discipline and artistic achievement. Descriptions of concerts emphasized not only the quality of the music, but also the orderliness of the presentation and the refinement of the audience. These accounts left little room for speculation, instead reinforcing the idea that the Academy was a fixed and stable part of the city's cultural life. In retrospect, it is clear that the environment of New Orleans during this period was one in which cultural institutions were shielded from certain forms of scrutiny. Reputation, once established, carried considerable weight, and Saint-Aurélien had invested years in crafting an image that appeared unassailable. Its leadership understood the importance of controlling access to information, limiting opportunities for outsiders to observe operations unfiltered. This control ensured that early indicators of irregularity remained scattered and inconclusive to anyone beyond the institution's walls. By the mid-1870s, the patterns that had emerged in earlier years continued without interruption. Adjustments to rosters, modifications to supply orders, and carefully worded correspondence remained part of the institution's rhythm. Public events continued to display the same polished perfection that had characterized the Academy from its founding. In the absence of any concentrated effort to examine these patterns in detail, they passed largely unnoticed, blending into the expected fluctuations of a long-established and respected boarding institution. The first concentrated review of Saint-Aurelien's records did not occur until the late 1870s, when a regional music society undertook an effort to catalogue the histories of its member institutions. The project was intended as a celebratory compilation of achievements rather than an investigative undertaking, but its researchers were granted temporary access to certain files for the purpose of documenting the Academy's contributions to the region's cultural life. It was during this process that the extent of the irregularities in the Academy's rosters began to emerge. The Society's researchers were provided with bound volumes containing concert programs, event notices, and the Academy's annual summaries. These materials were immaculate in presentation and consistent in their praise of the institution's accomplishments. However, when the researchers attempted to cross-reference the names of pupils listed in earlier programs with those in later events, they found a large number of individuals who appeared for only a single season or even a single performance before disappearing from the records entirely. In some cases, the same voice part was reassigned to another pupil without any public note of the change. A further layer of complexity arose when the Society attempted to obtain corresponding academic records to complete its profiles. The Academy's administration explained that such documents were not available for external review, citing the need to protect the privacy of its pupils. The refusal was delivered with formality, accompanied by assurances that the musical achievements of the choir were the most relevant aspect for the Society's purposes. While this was not unusual for the time, it left the researchers with incomplete histories for a significant portion of the pupils. One of the more persistent researchers, accustomed to documenting the careers of young musicians, noticed that certain pupils listed in the Academy's earliest rosters had no traceable history outside of Saint-Aurélien. There were no public notices of their enrollment in other schools, no mentions in church choirs or civic ensembles, and no appearances in the city's social listings. For others, the trail resumed after a gap of several years, with no indication of where they had studied or performed in the interim. These gaps, while not proof of any irregularity, stood out against the otherwise detailed records the Society maintained for pupils of other institutions. In correspondence between the Society and the Academy, the administration attributed the lack of continuity in these cases to the mobility of families and the personal circumstances of individual pupils. The tone of these replies was polite but final, offering no further elaboration. When pressed for additional details, the Academy reminded the Society that it was under no obligation to disclose private information. The exchange concluded with an invitation for the researchers to attend the next seasonal performance, which was framed as an opportunity to appreciate the current ensemble rather than dwell on the particulars of past rosters. The Music Society's report, when published, contained a glowing description of Saint-Aurélien's contributions to the regional arts scene. It did not include mention of the incomplete records or the inconsistencies in pupil histories. The omissions were not the result of suppression, but of editorial choice. The Society had no mandate to investigate beyond the scope of celebrating its members' achievements, yet the researchers involved retained their private notes, some of which would later resurface in archival collections. These notes included lists of names with annotations indicating gaps in documentation and queries that had gone unanswered. Around the same period, a merchant who had long supplied the Academy with certain imported goods undertook a private review of his own delivery records for the purposes of consolidating accounts. In doing so, he noticed that the quantities ordered for specific items, such as fabric for uniforms, varied more widely from year to year than he had assumed. Some years showed consistent increases aligned with growing enrollment, while others displayed sharp decreases in the middle of an academic cycle. These adjustments had been explained at the time as measures to use existing stock, yet when the merchant compared the figures to the publicly stated size of the choir, the numbers did not always align. The merchant's curiosity led him to make discreet inquiries with other suppliers, though these conversations were conducted informally and without any shared documentation. While some merchants had noticed similar variations, they expressed little concern, noting that large institutions often adjusted orders based on seasonal needs. Without a central record or coordinated effort, these observations remained isolated. The merchant eventually set aside his notes, concluding that the matter was not his to pursue. Among the few outside observers who took a closer interest in the Academy's inner workings was a local teacher who occasionally prepared pupils for admission to Saint-Aurélien. Over the course of several years, she noticed that some of her former students, once enrolled at the Academy, ceased correspondence without explanation. Inquiries made to the Academy received polite acknowledgements, but little detail beyond the familiar phrases about family decisions or transfers. The teacher began keeping her own list of pupils whose enrollment ended abruptly, though she had no means to verify the accuracy of the information given to her. By 1878, the combination of scattered notes, private observations, and unanswered questions had created a loose network of individuals who each possessed fragments of the same larger picture. However, without a central repository or formal inquiry, these fragments remained disconnected. The Academy continued to present itself as a model of discipline and cultural refinement, its seasonal performances drawing enthusiastic audiences and receiving unqualified praise in the press. The absence of coordinated scrutiny allowed its reputation to remain intact. It was in this context that a city archivist working on an unrelated project encountered a set of municipal documents containing early enrollment submissions from the Academy. These records had been filed when the institution first sought recognition for certain municipal privileges, such as exemptions from specific taxes on imported musical instruments. The archivist, accustomed to precise record-keeping, noted that the names listed in these early submissions did not align perfectly with later public rosters from the same years. Some pupils appeared in the municipal filings, but were absent from the Academy's own published materials. The archivist attempted to reconcile these differences by consulting other city records, such as census listings and property registries, but found that many of the names in question appeared only once before vanishing from official documentation. While such gaps were not unusual for transient populations or newly arrived families, the concentration of cases linked to a single institution was notable. The archivist made a private memorandum of the finding, but did not pursue the matter further, as it fell outside the scope of his assignment. In each of these instances, the irregularities were too small, too isolated, or too inconclusive to trigger any form of public alarm. The Academy's leadership, whether by intention or through long practice, had cultivated an environment in which such discrepancies could exist without undermining the institution's standing. The very structure of its operations, with information controlled at multiple levels and contact with outsiders limited to formal occasions, ensured that no single observer could assemble a complete account of its internal history. In early 1879, an unexpected opportunity for broader comparison arose when a music journal in New Orleans began compiling a feature on the city's most prominent choirs. The editor sought to highlight the evolution of musical training by including detailed histories of past members who had gone on to public careers. To achieve this, the journal contacted several institutions, requesting lists of notable former pupils, along with permission to interview them. Saint-Aurélien responded promptly, but its submission was far shorter than those from other schools. The list contained only a handful of names, all already well known to the public, and each was accompanied by a brief, polished account of achievements. When the editor asked whether additional names could be provided, the Academy replied that it maintained no extended directory of alumni and that only those currently active in public performances were deemed suitable for inclusion. This selective approach contrasted with the practices of other institutions, which often provided decades of historical names, regardless of current activity. The resulting article presented Saint-Aurélien's section as smaller but more exclusive, a portrayal that aligned with its cultivated image. Few readers noticed the brevity of the list, and those who did interpreted it as evidence of the Academy's high standards. At the same time, a clerk in the Municipal Records Office, tasked with reorganizing historical filings, came across documents related to the Academy's original charter and subsequent amendments. Among them were lists of boarding permits filed in compliance with local regulations on residential institutions. These permits recorded the names of all residents for a given term, both staff and pupils, and in several cases the names did not match those found in the Academy's own public materials. Some individuals appeared for only a single filing before disappearing from the record, and a few were replaced mid-term by others without any annotation explaining the change. The clerk's role did not involve investigating such discrepancies, yet he marked the irregularities in the margins before sending the documents to the archive. His notes were factual and without speculation, consisting only of check marks and brief references to other filings where names failed to match. These annotations would later be noticed by future researchers, though at the time they went unremarked outside the archive itself. Around this period, a bookseller who provided instructional texts to the Academy observed that certain orders, once regular and predictable, began to vary significantly. For years, the number of copies requested for standard educational works had matched the size of the public roster, but now the quantities fluctuated without correlation to any announced changes in enrollment. In one term, an order for a particular music theory manual was reduced by nearly half, only for the following term's order to increase well beyond the previous number. The bookseller, assuming internal curriculum adjustments, made no inquiry, but he recorded the shifts in his ledgers, where they remained a matter of routine business record. A more telling, though still indirect indication of internal change, came from the tailors responsible for choir garments. They reported occasional urgent requests for alterations to existing uniforms rather than the commissioning of new ones, as would be expected for incoming pupils. This suggested to them that replacements were being fitted into existing garments rather than outfitted anew. Such adjustments could have been explained by budgetary prudence, but in the context of an institution known for immaculate presentation, the practice was noteworthy. Still, no one raised the matter beyond casual observation among fellow tradesmen. The consistency of public events masked any perception of instability. Each seasonal concert was prepared with the same precision as in earlier years, programs printed in advance, and the choir appearing in full formation before attentive audiences. Reviews continued to speak of harmony, clarity, and disciplined beauty, without mention of changes in personnel. Guests saw the same orderly gardens, the same polished wood of the chapel's interior, and the same carefully maintained appearance of the grounds. To any casual observer, there was no visible cause for question. In private, however, a few individuals began to recognize the limits of the Academy's transparency. One former tutor, now employed elsewhere, reflected that during her tenure she had been aware of unexplained absences, but had lacked both the authority and the information to understand them. Her recollection, written years later in a personal diary, described an environment in which changes were accepted as administrative prerogative and not subject to discussion. Staff who pressed for clarification were reminded of the Academy's emphasis on discretion, a value presented as integral to its mission. Another point of interest emerged when a visiting ensemble from another city was hosted at Saint-Aurélien for a collaborative performance. The visiting director, comparing notes afterward, mentioned that the choir seemed smaller in certain sections than the published program indicated. When asked, the Academy's representatives explained that a few members had been temporarily reassigned to academic duties due to illness or family matters. The explanation was delivered with such composure and formality that it satisfied the visitors, who had no reason to question it further. These interactions, while brief, reveal how the Academy's leadership was able to address inquiries with confidence and finality. Responses were framed in language that conveyed both authority and propriety, ensuring that no further discussion seemed necessary. This skill in managing external perception was as much a part of Saint-Aurélien's operations as its musical training. By the close of 1879, scattered hints of irregularity had surfaced in trade records, municipal filings, and private recollections, yet none had coalesced into a coherent challenge to the Academy's standing. The separation of information across multiple unconnected sources ensured that each observation remained isolated. The merchant with altered orders did not know of the clerk's annotated permits, and the music society's incomplete rosters were not compared with the bookseller's fluctuating deliveries. Without connection, the fragments could not form a full account. Inside the Academy, routines continued unchanged. The daily schedule of bells, rehearsals, and study sessions remained in place, and the grounds were maintained with the same care as before. New pupils arrived each term, blending into the existing order without ceremony, while others departed quietly under the standard explanations. The administration's hold on its internal narrative was complete, and the institution's reputation in New Orleans remained unblemished. By the early 1880s, Saint Aurélien had reached a stage in which its legacy was seen as firmly established. Its name appeared in cultural listings alongside the city's most prominent institutions, and its public image had remained unchanged for over 2 decades. Visitors still found the same manicured grounds, the same structured schedule, and the same polished performances that had long defined the academy. The impression of permanence was so strong that few considered the possibility of its eventual decline. The Academy's concerts during this period drew audiences that included both long-standing patrons and a newer generation of listeners. The programs retained their formality, printed in heavy type on thick paper, with each piece listed alongside the name of its composer. The order of performances seldom varied, and the visual presentation of the choir remained symmetrical and precise. It was this consistency, more than any innovation, that reinforced the perception of the Academy as a stable and enduring presence. The leadership's ability to maintain such continuity relied in part on a set of practices that had been refined over the years. Public events were scheduled well in advance, with any potential disruptions managed quietly. If a pupil left the institution between the announcement of a concert and the date of the event, the program was adjusted before printing, eliminating the need for public explanation. Similarly, internal changes to staffing or governance were made without formal announcements, replaced instead by a seamless continuation of established routines. In private correspondence between members of the board, there are references to the importance of safeguarding the Academy's reputation. These letters, preserved in scattered collections, contain language emphasizing the value of discretion and the need to present a unified image to the city. While the content is administrative rather than personal, the tone reflects an understanding that the Academy's standing depended as much on perception as on performance. Such correspondence also reveals the extent to which board members coordinated their public statements, ensuring that any inquiry received an answer consistent with the official narrative. The influence of the Academy extended beyond its own walls through its alumni, though in a limited and carefully managed way. A small number of former pupils went on to perform in civic choirs or serve as instructors in other schools, and their connection to Saint Aurélien was always highlighted in official accounts. However, there was no organized alumni association, and the Academy did not publish lists of graduates. In doing so, it avoided the need to account for pupils whose records might be incomplete or whose departure had not been publicly acknowledged. In the surrounding community, the Academy's grounds were viewed with a mix of admiration and reserve. The walls and gates that marked its boundaries were both a physical and symbolic division, reminding visitors that life inside was governed by its own rules. On designated visiting days, the public was admitted to the gardens and chapel, where they were shown well-prepared displays of student work and rehearsed musical selections. These occasions were carefully staged to present the Academy at its most impressive. Beyond these glimpses, little was known of daily life within the dormitories or classrooms. Municipal officials who interacted with the Academy tended to do so in the context of ceremonial events, such as festivals or commemorations. Their reports described the institution as a model of order and refinement, echoing the language used in public programs and press coverage. The lack of administrative oversight from outside authorities was typical for the era, especially for institutions that operated without public funding. As long as Saint Aurélien fulfilled its visible role in the city's cultural life, there was little incentive for closer examination. Within the Academy, the structure of life had become so entrenched that changes were absorbed without noticeable disruption. New pupils adapted quickly to the established routines, guided by tutors who had themselves been trained under the same system. The cycle of study, rehearsal, and performance functioned like a fixed framework into which each term's participants were fitted. It was this predictability, coupled with the isolation of the grounds, that allowed the Academy to maintain an unchanging outward appearance despite the gradual turnover of individuals inside. One of the few contemporary descriptions of the Academy's inner environment comes from a visiting educator, invited to observe the music instruction. In his notes, he remarked on the precision of the vocal exercises and the disciplined posture of the pupils, but he also noted the absence of informal interaction between them during scheduled breaks. Movement from one activity to another was orderly, and conversation when it occurred was quiet and brief. The visitor interpreted this as a sign of the Academy's high standards, though it also suggested the extent to which life there was governed by fixed expectations. The Academy's finances during this period appear to have remained stable, supported by a combination of tuition, donations, and occasional endowment contributions. Expenditure records show regular investments in maintenance and supplies, as well as the acquisition of new sheet music and occasional repairs to the organ. There is no indication of financial distress, and the prompt payment of merchant invoices reinforced the perception of reliability among suppliers. Even in the absence of any public controversy, subtle indications of the institution's insularity persisted. The practice of controlling information remained in place, with correspondence handled by a small group of administrators and access to internal records restricted. This system ensured that the Academy's narrative was consistent across all points of contact with the outside world. By avoiding unnecessary disclosures and limiting external involvement, the leadership preserved the appearance of a seamless and unchanging history. To the citizens of New Orleans in the early 1880s, Saint Aurélien was a familiar and reassuring presence. Its performances marked the seasons, its gardens provided a setting for polite conversation on visiting days, and its reputation lent an air of distinction to the city's cultural profile. Few could imagine that the institution's carefully maintained image might not reflect the entirety of its operations. It was this very stability, coupled with a long history of polished presentation, that allowed the Academy to pass from year to year without inviting the kind of inquiry that might reveal the less visible details of its past. By the middle of the decade, the name of Saint Aurélien had become so firmly associated with refinement that it was invoked in civic speeches and printed in guidebooks as a point of local pride. Travelers arriving in New Orleans were encouraged to attend one of the Academy's seasonal concerts if they wished to witness the city's highest expression of musical discipline. The fact that its operations remained largely opaque to outsiders was rarely regarded as a concern. For most, the visible evidence of excellence was sufficient proof of the institution's merit. In cultural gatherings, patrons spoke of the Academy as though it were an enduring fixture, immune to the shifts that affected other organizations. Even when other schools or societies experienced temporary declines or reorganizations, Saint Aurélien appeared unaffected. Its schedule of performances remained steady, its presentation consistent, and its leadership unchanged in tone and approach. This stability gave it an air of inevitability, as though its continued presence required no explanation. Inside the walls, the administration preserved this perception through the same methods it had employed for decades. Information leaving the Academy was measured and deliberate, shaped to maintain the desired impression. Visitors were shown only prepared spaces and rehearsed performances. Correspondence with families, donors, and civic bodies was concise, formal, and focused on positive developments. Administrative matters that did not directly support the institution's public image were kept within the board and senior staff. As the 1880s progressed, a small shift occurred in the makeup of the board. A few long-serving members were replaced by individuals with similar backgrounds and connections, ensuring continuity in both policy and presentation. Meeting notes from this period, where they survive, reflect ongoing attention to the preservation of the Academy's reputation. Discussions of future plans centered on maintaining the existing schedule of concerts, securing resources for upkeep, and reinforcing relationships with influential patrons. The tone suggests that stability remained the primary objective, with little interest in altering the institution's established methods. The physical appearance of the grounds also played a role in sustaining the narrative of order and permanence. Gardens continued to be maintained in precise symmetry, pathways were kept free of debris, and the buildings showed no visible signs of neglect. The chapel's interior was polished before each visiting day, and the dormitory windows were kept spotless from the outside. These details, while mundane, reinforced the impression that the Academy was as meticulous in its management as it was in its music. Merchants and tradesmen who worked with the Academy during this period described their dealings as efficient and predictable. Deliveries were accepted promptly, invoices settled without dispute, and special requests accommodated when necessary. While occasional fluctuations in order quantities continued, they were explained in practical terms and caused no interruption in service. The reputation for reliability in these transactions mirrored the institution's broader public standing. In the city at large, there was little incentive to look more closely at an establishment that seemed to function without difficulty. The Academy contributed to civic events, provided a point of cultural pride, and carried no trace of public scandal. Its insularity, rather than arousing suspicion, was viewed as part of its dignified character. In this environment, the possibility of examining its internal records or questioning its enrollment history was remote. Yet even as the Academy maintained its facade, the same patterns that had marked earlier years continued quietly in the background. The gradual turnover of pupils, the absence of public acknowledgement for certain departures, and the careful shaping of official records all persisted. To those within the institution, these practices had become routine elements of administration, unremarkable in themselves. To outsiders, they remained invisible, hidden beneath the smooth surface of polished performances and formal correspondence. By the late 1880s, Saint Aurelien's place in New Orleans society seemed assured. It had outlasted other cultural ventures of its era, weathered shifts in the city's economy, and maintained a standard of presentation that impressed both residents and visitors. The occasional fragment of information that hinted at a more complex internal history remained confined to scattered archives, private papers, and the memories of those who had once been. Inside its walls, without a concerted effort to gather and compare these fragments, they remained only isolated details, incapable of altering the prevailing view. When the final decade of the century began, the Academy's public image was the same as it had been for nearly 30 years, a disciplined, orderly, and accomplished institution dedicated to the cultivation of music and the maintenance of decorum. The quiet consistency of its operations ensured that it would be remembered in civic accounts as a symbol of stability, even if the full record of its history was never assembled in one place. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story was taken from documents that were found. All names have been edited to protect the source.